Are you lost amidst a blizzard of digital marketing information? Are you looking for the most effective way to get in front of the pack using your own expert knowledge? Or are you striving to become an industry leader online? Come in from the cold and join us inside the Igloo today, the #1 content marketing show for peeps who like winning. Each episode of Inside the Igloo, you'll get the inside scoop on what's working and what's not in the world of content marketing from global leaders in the game. Inside the Igloo, we interview the experts who will offer strategy, advice, tips, and tricks that'll set you on a path to branded digital leadership in your field. Inside the Igloo. Stop fighting the icy winds of confusion. Step out of the storm and come in from the cold. Warm up with expert knowledge inside the Igloo, the #1 content marketing show for peeps who like winning with your host, Wes Ward. Inside the Igloo.
Welcome to Inside the Igloo, the #1 podcast show for people who like winning. I'm your host, Wes Ward from Melbourne, Australia. As usual, our regular co-host, Mr. Agency himself from the Karcher Group in Columbus, Ohio, is Nate Riggs. How are you, Nate?
Good. Thanks so much for having me, Wes. I've never actually been called Mr. Agency before, so I'll have to take that one on.
Yeah, no, I was reading your bio over the weekend as I was putting together Content Igloo magazine, and I just got into it a bit deeper, and I noticed, especially from our discussion last week, we were talking about the concept that some bigger branded agencies, when they don't have the capability in the digital space or content marketing space, they sometimes have to go and hire or acquire rock stars or mavens to fill out their capability. Is this what the Karcher Group did in your case?
Yeah, I think that was part of the strategy. I wouldn't really, consider myself the rock star, ninja, maven, whatever it is, but I did have a base of business in terms of content marketing and had been consulting successfully on my own for a few years. And that was a case where the agency looked at kind of the skill set and really, there was a little bit aspect of a business acquisition in terms of existing clients, but really it was more about talent acquisition. Myself and a partner of mine, Sarah J. Store, you can tweet at her at Sarah J. Store on Twitter. That was really our stick, and that was something that TKG had dabbled in, but not really, put a lot of effort into organically building that business. So it just made a lot of sense for them to kind of buy it in. And I think you're seeing a lot of agencies do that today.
So from your point of view, what was the attraction? There's a lot of people out there, and there may be a lot of people on this call right now that, like to run their own business. They've got it going. You've taken it by the horns and done it yourself as well. What was the attraction in moving into an agency? It's sort of, to me, would have thought that, the appeal may be not as great unless, the support network's there, the resources, the team, the client list may be more appealing, especially in terms of the diversity, perhaps.
Well, I think it was twofold, and you hit the nail on the head with one. A lot of times as a consultant, you work with a client to develop the strategy and kind of get the insights going and move them in the right direction. But then it comes time to execute. And from a content and social marketing perspective, there's a lot of tools available out there to help you do that. But at some point with any client, you're going to end up touching web properties. You're going to end up having to do design development, coding, programming. And that became a real mess when you're trying to work with multiple contractors. Some are good, some don't deliver as promised. And there's just a lot of project management hassle that goes along with it. So the opportunity to move in an agency where that infrastructure was already in place was very, very attractive. And for me, it really came down to a personal life choice. I really enjoyed being on my own. I enjoyed being an independent consultant, and perhaps someday, I'll end up back in that world. But at the time I decided to move to TKG, we were pregnant with our third child. And so I had a baby on the way. The life of a consultant, I was working, crazy hours, traveling a lot. And so it just made a lot of sense to kind of, get back to a little bit more reasonable work hours, have a team around you that you could, kind of leverage their talents and their creativity and their hands to get a lot more work done, and buy back a little bit of that family time to spend time with the kids while they're still young. So that was really kind of what spurred my decision to make the move.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people can empathize with that, having that resources and support base, but also, to a degree, sticking to the knitting, doing what you really love doing, which is that strategy and content development. When you start to get outside of those areas, like having to build a website or whatever that may be, the fun can sort of come out of it. And I think that's really important to know as well. Thanks for that. What's really interesting this week is that the second edition of Content Igloo magazine was produced over the weekend, and we're just talking off air. The concept that we're putting forward is content marketing, and that every business should do it, and every business should become a publisher. With that comes responsibilities, and I found I got an email from someone demanding where's the second edition of Content Igloo magazine, and that was a real wake-up call for me, because sometimes you publish things and it just goes out to the universe and you think no one's looking or listening. Have you found that when you publish content, you assume no one's hearing because you don't see a tweet or a retweet or a comment? It feels like no one's out there, no one's listening, but actually people are.
I agree with you there too. I think people are listening, and the challenge comes is that we don't always see everything. I use a variety of different tools for things that I publish on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and even on my own blog. And sometimes, I'll look at a post that doesn't get any comments and think, okay, nobody's heard that. And then I'll go, into one analytics tool and may see 6 or 7 retweets. And then maybe another analytics tool shows me that it's been retweeted 10 times or it's gotten in front of 100,000 people. So you never really know how content's going to spread throughout the system, because I do think that at a certain point, unless you're using very, very sophisticated tools, you kind of lose some of that trackability. You lose a little bit of visibility as to who's actually digesting the content. And publishing is like a freight train. Once you start, you kind of got to keep the train moving, because that audience is going to expect to see the next edition. And at the end of the day, that's really what you want. You want the audience to be expecting your next piece of content.
Yeah, and it's an interesting analogy I picked up a little while ago. A lot of people keep talking about content's king, and I sort of agree with it. The content's got to be great. It's got to be relevant and of value. But I sort of think, consistency is the queen, if not king. If you're just not putting out on time at a regular schedule, imagine if the 6 o'clock news just didn't turn up at 6 o'clock every day. Things just wouldn't work out.
Yeah, it's this idea that's been around in broadcasting for many, many years, the idea of programming. And if you think about it, broadcasting is a good model for anything, at least when you're talking about online content, because broadcasting is just media. And that's really where we are today. The internet is just one big new media channel. So the idea of programming, of making sure that you're consistent with your publishing times, airing new episodes, establishing a release time for that's really kind of what trains the audience to develop a behavior to make sure that they come back for more. I use the analogy in America, there's a very popular television show called Modern Family, and my wife and I really enjoy this show. And
Just getting into it, I'm loving it.
Yeah, it's a really great writing. It's a hysterical show. And it's on in the U.S., it's on every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern time. So my wife and I know that at 9 p.m. Eastern time, that's usually when we're going to sit down on the couch and watch this show, unless we've DVR'd it. But, even with the DVR, we're still watching within, 20 or 30 minutes of the airtime. And so we've been trained to expect a new episode. And because of that, we subscribe. We sit down every week and we watch this. And I think content marketers that are savvy can apply the same type of a strategy to what they're publishing and what they're producing.
Well, what it also came from me as a result of that is that obviously having a plan is critical. And I'd, because I've been going through that process and, obviously putting together these podcasts, but also the magazine and also blog posts for the upcoming release of the website that by the time this is published will be up and running. Planning is just so critical, and I'm putting it up there in the 80% of the effort category, because with that provides the clarity and the certainty, which makes all other things really quick to produce. Now, on my magazine this weekend, because I'd done the planning, 2 weeks earlier, and I knew our point of difference, our mission, what we're about, it was so easy to pull it together and find the right stories and have the right angles, because that hard work was done. And I just think there's no avoiding that. In order to get that consistency, it's going to come down to the planning, but also the team members that we have. Like you're part of the team. We know that over here in Australia at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, we're good to go. And we can rely on that. I've got support staff overseas to produce this, because without it, it just gets too hard and too stressful. And I think for people who want to get into this, especially smaller business or medium-sized businesses, they've got to be aware of that up front. You're probably seeing with a lot of your client base.
Yeah, it's, it is kind of something that I think mid-sized and larger companies are dealing with right now, because they're still in this mindset of moving away from the more traditional types of marketing and really embracing this idea of publishing consistent content and making that a part of their business. And, we've seen, the bigger companies like Coca-Cola do this, and Pepsi and Red Bull, but for smaller companies that have less personnel or less of a budget, it is very challenging, because oftentimes they are working with contractors and they're competing with more traditional marketing calendars. And so how do you slot everything in and make sure that there's enough time and resources available to actually produce it? And I think once you kind of get through that initial 1 or 2 or 3 months of setting up the tone and setting up the framework that you're going to work from, then it's simply just going in and slotting in the new content. But the hard part is really developing the framework that the content's going to be launched from.
Absolutely. And so even at Karcher, do you, when you've got a new client on and they say, yeah, we believe in what you're saying about content marketing and social media and building a new audience base directly of our own, do you guys typically sit down and have like a planning day or a brainstorming day and then fine tune that plan before outlining the next phase?
It's interesting because we struggle with this a lot. The way that we start with most of our clients is really from kind of the insights and strategy phase. Because you're getting a lot of businesses too that are very hot on the idea of content marketing. But when you really dig into what they already have going on in terms of their websites or blogs or social profiles, you find a lot of holes. You find, that even if we produce a content plan that's going to get attention from the audience, do we have a web property, i.e. a website or a blog, that's actually going to convert that audience into some type of business key performance indicator, whether it's a lead or a new sale? And so a lot of times we have to start from the insights phase, kind of work backwards and say, okay, we know that there's all of this that we can do, but unless we fix how these online properties are built and the architecture and how they convert and the calls to action and the optimization of it, none of the rest of the content activities that we do are going to be as effective as they should be. So it's almost kind of like a hurry up and wait scenario where you get in, and a lot of times we have to pull our clients back and say, look, we want to do all this for you, but if we don't do these 3 things first, nothing else that we do beyond that is going to be as successful as it needs to be for your business.
I find that a lot, especially with clients. You just about have to pull the business apart and rebuild it before you can really get cracking. And that may be even some things as fundamental as what's your mission? What is the overriding benefit of doing business with you? What problem are you going to solve? Even those things, I think for a lot of business owners, CEOs, they've got it in their mind, but it hasn't been articulated, whether it's, in their business plan, or it's certainly not articulated all through their websites. There may be inconsistencies there. Like you touch on, what's the conversion process? What's the funnel look like? What's in it for the visitor along the way? And what's the overarching big promise that dealing with your business is going to be, And that was, what evolved through some pretty hardcore thinking about what Content Igloo means. What is it as a brand? And after a lot of thinking, I got to the point where we're in the process of helping businesses become publishers. Now, that's fine, but what's the real goal? And the real goal is for businesses to own their own audience. So our remit as Content Igloo is to help businesses become publishers so they can own their own audience. And that's the whole point of content marketing, is that you can have a direct relationship with an audience. You don't have to go through intermediaries such as, advertising agencies or dealing directly with newspapers or TVs, where, via advertising, you're essentially renting access to their audience. If you've got your own, obviously, your marketing overhead's going to be a lot lower.
Yeah, and I think, we've seen a lot of businesses do that, essentially rent the audience of influencers. I mean, that's where the term influencer marketing comes from, is that a lot of businesses realize that it was a very steep uphill climb and a long distance to get from where they are today to where they want to be as content marketers, in the future, in the next 12 to 18 to 24 months. And so the short-term fix is, well, for the immediate future, let's just go and leverage the audience of somebody who's already got it, whether it's on, a blog or Instagram or even a YouTube video channel. And you see mixed results with that. Sometimes it works very, very well, and sometimes, it doesn't, because at the end of the day, just because that influencer has an audience and that audience buys into what they say. And even if that person uses and endorses the products or services, there's still sometimes a disconnect between that audience and the brand that they're supporting. Very, very savvy influencers have figured out how to close that gap a little bit, but nobody's at 100% yet in my mind in terms of leveraging influencers to kind of, build out a new audience or add new members to their audience or kind of create a short-term solution while the rest of their content marketing program gets up to speed.
Yeah, what I'd say though is that influencer has brought their own audience to the table. So, a product or brand who wants to access their audience is still doing it metaphorically the same old way. They've had to, do a deal, either bring them into their tent or, do some form of an arrangement where that influence is going to try and, rub a bit of their magic dust over their audience with regards to a product. And it's the same with, newspapers or TV. Where my head's at now is that the actual business itself can have its own audience. And, this was the main theme for today's episode was how far can this go? What are the big brands doing? In the second edition of the magazine, we covered Coca-Cola and what they're doing. But things are really ramping up now, and it's quite interesting because on TV, a lot of press about the Austrian dude who jumped out of near edge of space for Redbull, and I was just looking at that going, what an amazing piece of content. And they've obviously sponsored this guy for like 2 years. It must have cost a fortune, but they obviously see it as a good investment in their brand to keep putting themselves forward. Did you get massive media coverage on that space jump over in the States?
We didn't see anything on traditional media, but it obviously was all over the internet. What I think is fascinating about that and what Red Bull does very, very well is they have this way of taking their audience profile or their audience persona and reversing it to make that the focus of their content. So, hiring this guy who's doing this crazy extreme sports stuff that the majority of people won't do really fits with their brand because over the past couple of years, they've really positioned themselves as that extreme brand. You saw this in the release of the movie, The Art of Flight, which was produced, I believe, about a year ago and hit theaters. And it was kind of chronicling a bunch of different snowboarders as they went around the world. But Red Bull is excellent at identifying that one person that is really going to captivate their audience with something that's so out of this world that there's really no other brand that can touch them in that extreme sports, extreme lifestyle space. And I think we'll see some really innovative things come out of that. If you go to their Instagram account, for instance, you can now get onto the new Instagram web interface and kind of see the reverse timeline of all the photos that they're taking and whatnot. And there's recently been, a shoot over in Brazil where they're showing people doing extreme moves on bikes and skateboarding and bungee jumping and all kinds of different stuff. So they do an amazing job at really capturing what the audience really kind of wants to see and what resonates with their lifestyle.
While you're talking, it made me think of a couple of things as part of the preparation, and I've got it pegged down for another episode that part of content marketing is to really identify your target persona or avatar. And what I'm hearing right now is that Red Bull have done an incredible job of identifying their target consumer, their avatar or persona, and then they're throwing extreme levels or aspirational examples of their target person out there. If they're saying, okay, we're the athletic brand, we're the edgy sort of Mr. Schmidt pilot or something like that, we're going to put so many examples of, the elite, the crazy, the Olympic level type of examples in front of them, and that's their relevance with that channel.
But I think I think you're right on that. They've done a great job with that, but it even goes beyond that because the guy sitting in his cubicle in corporate America drinking the Red Bull to stay awake during the day still has that aspirational, desire to be that guy jumping out of the plane or be the guy roaring down a mountain at 100 miles an hour. So I think there's even more versatility to identifying that really extreme target, that really extreme persona, and working backwards from there, because at the end of the day, everybody dreams. Everybody, has that. And really Red Bull with their extreme sports stuff hits that daydream factor, hits that stuff that even if you're at a desk and you pull up the Art of Flight promo video, you're still going to sit down and watch this video and be captivated by it. There was actually a part in the video where they showed the actual branded Redbull helicopter go up this slope and literally do a 180-degree vertical turn and dive down the slope next to a snowboarder. I must have watched that video 6 or 7 different times just to see that pilot do that stunt. It was really, really amazing. And
wow.
Lo and behold, there's still the Redbull logo and all the stuff all over that helicopter. So, effective marketing, I would say so.
You've got to send me the link to that, and we'll put it on the show notes as well, because I haven't seen that. It's did you say Instagram have got a new webinar feature?
Yeah, Instagram actually, I believe it was either late last week or early this week. No, it would have been early last week. Launched a web interface. So now you can go to Instagram.com/your name or whatever name of a profile you want to look at, and you can actually go and view somebody's Instagram uploads on the web. Now, while that's kind of cool, there's been web interfaces for Instagram. Webstagram is one of them that's much more, in my opinion, search-based, and there's a few others out there. Instagram maintains that, their focus is mobile, and they're probably not going to budge from that, and rightly so. I think that's, they know where their business lives. But the web interface is one of those nice to have things. And what I think it does for content marketers is it gives you a little bit more longevity in the story that you're telling with your photos. I'm actually running a series on this right now on tkgenius.com, which is my agency's blog. So look up tkgenius/Instagram and you'll find all kinds of different posts on this. But it'll be interesting to watch how Instagram evolves over the next couple of years. And I think there's a lot of big advantages for content marketers to jump in and start to use it.
Well, it's interesting. From our end, we haven't seen Facebook sort of meddle with it at this stage. And I assume they'll just let it go and just slowly integrate in there. What I noticed in the papers this week that Redbull, and this is just how far they're pushing content marketing, is that they're publishing theatre productions over here in Melbourne. And I was just looking at this and going, wow, clearly this is making money for them. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. They would be making money on these productions, like ticket sales. But in terms of their brand, they're just continuously investing. They've obviously worked out, the aspirations of their target audience and their drinkers and consumers. But I was just over at their website on their media house side, and the productions that they're creating is just phenomenal. The volume, the quality's there, but also just the amount of different areas they're involved in is just staggering. So they obviously get it and are pushing it to the max.
Well, and I think too, one side is content marketing, but the other side, the most important side of content marketing is the experiential side. Without having some type of an event or some type of an experience for the consumer to have, you're limited on what content you can produce. So if you look in America, and they probably do this internationally, Red Bull hosts the Flutog series, which is basically where people get together and they create their own flying machine. Some of them are just out of this world absurd, and some of them are actually well engineered. And then they set up an event where they literally launch people in these machines over water because they don't want to kill anybody, obviously. But they make an event out of seeing if these people's machines can actually fly. And then out of that comes a variety of different content, not only from the Red Bull side of things, from the brand side, but also from the user side of things. You get a lot of user-generated content that comes out of these events. And I think that's something, we look at Xbox does a lot of that stuff at different summer festivals around the country in the U.S. Things like Rothbury or Bonnaroo, these festivals that sometimes bring 50 to 100,000 people to see bands for a few days. And you find these big brands like Red Bull and Microsoft involved in these because every single event like that is an experience that can then be turned into content.
Absolutely. While you were speaking, it reminded me of the Birdman Rally over here in Melbourne in March. People jump off a bridge into the Yarra River, and so that whoever gets the furthest wins. But it's I'm sure Red Bull could probably get all over that at some stage. It's a hilarious event and gets a lot of media coverage every year. Just on this, as part of our episode of big brands and how far this content can go, let's have a look at the cola industry. We spoke about Coca-Cola, and content marketing as a leadership vehicle is something that's really appealing to me. I advise and mention to people that above all else, creating good content is an expectation of your particular market. Someone's got to lead the market. So anyone who's looking for leaders will be expecting good stuff to come out where they're at, whether it's on mobile, whether it's just shared around on a website. Coca-Cola are really going hard at it, but also Pepsi's the perennial number 2. They're following up as well. I know you've done a little bit of research in this area. I haven't looked deep into what Pepsi's doing, especially in relation to Coca-Cola. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the cola wars and how content marketing's unfolding there.
Well, the majority of the market share in the U.S. is held by Coca-Cola. Pepsi's market share is still very, very, very small in comparison. The only reason I know that is because of some years that I spent working in the restaurant industry. But as of today, well, to back things up, we know that Coca-Cola launched the Content 2020 Manifesto a few months back, and this is basically a rework of their strategy for content marketing. And what was interesting is they developed a strategy for content marketing, and then they actually launched and promoted it with 2 videos that went viral on the web that kind of had a lot of the details as to what was important to Coca-Cola, how they were going to embrace this new area of marketing.
Just so you know, Nate, I've featured both those videos in the second issue of Content Igloo magazine because I felt that they were that important.
And they were, it really is. It's brilliant work, and it's not only brilliant work in terms of strategy, but it's really putting your money where your mouth is. How appropriate to launch your content strategy through content. And really what I think is it signifies this big shift in consumer behavior because Coca-Cola realized that their ability to control the message is dwindling. And like a lot of brands, that's true. We just don't have the ability to control the message like we used to. We can only influence and promote the message, but once it's in the hands of consumers, it's up to them to, share it on their social networks, discuss it with friends, write other stories about it. And it's this really interesting rise, I guess, in the attractiveness of using stories to market a business rather than the 4 Ps, the more promotional messages. And that's really what I think Coca-Cola is going after and some stuff that I've read on them. What's interesting is as of today, they just launched Coca-Cola Journey, which is essentially a branded remake of their website. So one of the very first companies to actually brand and create a brand as to a website redesign. Now that's, I don't know about you, but I've not heard of any companies actually branding their website redesign. Have you?
No, I haven't. But just for the benefit of the audience, I'm at the website coca-colacompany.com. I'm seeing Hugh Akerson's New Flavors of the South, stories, opinions, brands. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be a lot of product placement as such. It's definitely a lot of video-based content. They're certainly talking about by the numbers, how many tweets, the years they've been going. Obviously, they've got to put their brand out there. I think even just psychologically, the color schemes being that bold, aggressive red and the black are already there because we're already educated on what Coca-Cola is. Very, very interesting, and I'm sort of liking it because it's all about the user and not about the product.
It's an interesting take on a public company's corporate website, because it's very much a magazine-style website. If you were looking at, I don't know exactly how they build it, but it would be similar to a lot of WordPress themes that you see that are classified as magazine styles. And with that, they've shifted their focus to categories that I think probably speak to the lifestyle of Coca-Cola consumers, i.e. the people who drink Coke. So you see a lot of different content vehicles, delivery vehicles, blogs, different video clips, even opinion columns and photo galleries. But I think the biggest shift is that you got to remember that Coca-Cola is primarily a business-to-business company, and yet they've shifted their website to speak to a consumer audience, to basically market to a consumer audience. So from their marketing strategy perspective, they're going directly to consumers to try to build the groundswell to then go to they're then going to places like restaurants or grocery stores that carry Coca-Cola and trying to increase sales that way. And that's a really interesting marketing approach to really build the buzz in the consumer and create the demand for Coca-Cola products through content that then helps the businesses who ultimately buy the shipments of Coke from the company.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that I'm absolutely 100% convinced of is that Coca-Cola have always been in the lifestyle business. They, especially over here growing up as a kid, they were always advertising that's how they got their lifestyle message across. We were bombarded with Coke adds life as a kid, and then, life is better with a Coke in your hand. Always images of the beach, always, massive big beach balls where, young, hot male and females, teenagers were all bouncing around having the best time of their life. But the only way they could push forward their lifestyle brand was via advertising, via the TV. What's really, really different now is that they can push it out off their own website, that they can go direct. And that's what's fascinating about this. I think they've always known their position. They always know that they're a lifestyle brand, and they're basically selling through. Like you say, they are a business to business. They sell to wholesalers, etc. But they're creating that pull for their distributors, which is obviously very compelling. If you're a retail outlet, who do you choose between an unknown cola brand and one that's globally known, that's positioned itself as, a great value lifestyle brand? It's fun, exciting, hip. Yeah, that was just really, really amazing, is that I think they were always in that business, but now they can do it direct and they don't need to go and rent access via the TV channels. I'm looking at Sachin Tendulkar, who you may not be aware of, is the leading cricketer in India. And in India, cricket is beyond the pale. It's so big, and he is revered like a god. These guys are getting Sachin Tendulkar on their website. You know what that's going to do to drive interest in India? It's just phenomenal. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Well, and it's, I think their site is appropriate because even we had talked about how it's branded as Coca-Cola Journey. Even the name Journey came from an internal magazine that was published to Coca-Cola employees called Journey, and that magazine ran from 1987 to 1997. And if you think about the irony in that, they've, after all of this time, they've moved back to this idea of a magazine that speaks to lifestyle, that can feature sports players, and that gives them the versatility to kind of speak to audiences around the world, because Coca-Cola is definitely a global brand. Now, I think what's interesting, and there was a New York Times article that had a quote from Ashley Brown, who is the Coca-Cola Director of Digital Communications and Social Media. And basically, to sum up what she said, this website, this Coca-Cola Journey website, has 4 full-time employees that are completely devoted to working on this site and organizing the content. And they're also pulling content from over 40 freelance writers and photographers, as well as other internal employees throughout the Coke system in public relations and marketing and so on and so forth. So I guess the caveat here is that what smaller company or what middle-sized business has those types of resources? Probably none, to say the least. So, while I think Coca-Cola is doing a great job and there's a lot of lessons to be learned from their strategy, what I think a lot of content marketers are going to struggle with looking at this case study is, okay, how do we actually do something like that? Or how do we actually do even a small fraction of what Coca-Cola is able to do because they have almost unlimited resources and budget?
Absolutely. Which made me think that, it's even more important to get planning right. Because if you do have limited resources and can only have time or money to create, say, one video a week, okay, what is that video going to be about? You want to be so well planned, so articulate that you're hitting your target consumer right between the eyes, in terms of high relevance, high value. And that's where I think that the planning is just so important for the lesser resourced. Obviously, they plan very well at Coca-Cola, but for the medium-sized business that may have a staff of only 10 and one person's doing all the marketing, how are they going to work that out? And I just feel that the planning, so that you can leverage the resources of your organization, one person, if you've got 10 people in your organization, each one of those might be able to do one article, and that's it. There's 10 months of straight away. They're sort of shifting or insourcing the production there, but I think it really comes down to the planning, because if you're asking other people to contribute, you're going to say, well, I don't know what to write about. What am I supposed to create a video on? And how is that going to be relevant to your target consumer of that media? I think the planning is just going to be critical.
Yeah, planning and the mentality that I would add that the mentality of choosing wisely, planning your strategy, making sure that you have the capacity to execute that, but then realizing that you can't be in all places at all at one time. So picking out what is going to create, out of all these content marketing vehicles we can use, out of all the things that we can do, what is really going to get us the closest to the audience and produce the most bang for the buck? And I think sometimes that's probably one of the hardest decisions to make for businesses, because everybody wants to do everything. But at the end of the day, we have to be really reasonable and realize that, prioritization is key here. And that, I think, does go along with planning that you mentioned.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a huge episode. We're already over the 40-minute mark. I think this big branded concept is fascinating. I think it shows how far this concept of content marketing can really go. The reason why we put it into this episode today was for the audience to know what's possible, but then we'll pull back from that. And so in later episodes, we can talk about tools, which are free, which are paid, ways for the medium size and the smaller size business owners and marketers can really affect this. But at least we've got a picture of what's possible and what the big boys are doing, and the ones with big budgets, where they're spending their money. I think it's been a really, really fascinating insight into this, Nate. I really appreciate your input. More of a housekeeping, as we said, issue 2 of Content Igloo magazine is in the newsstand. Soak it all up. The Coca-Cola episode is in there, as well as the great audience shift white paper that I wrote over the weekend. Nate, is there any big announcements at the Karcher Group before we sign off?
Not any huge announcements, but we're moving forward with our own content program. So I do want to plug the blog, tkgenius.com. That's tkgenius.com. We've got about 24 different contributors. I am the managing editor, so pretty much a full agency blog. And we're trying to hit 7 posts a week right now. So if you're interested in kind of how-to information on content marketing, both for big business and small business, please give us a check out. And if you're so inclined, subscribe. We'll be able to give you the updates for free.
I'll definitely be across that. That's tkgenius.com. Thank you once again, Nate, from the Karcher Group in Columbus, Ohio. You've been listening to Inside the Igloo with Wes Ward and Nate Riggs. Thank you very much for your time. Bye for now.
You've just been Inside the Igloo, the #1 content marketing show for peeps that like winning, with your host, Wes Ward. For more information about leading your market online, visit Content Igloo at www.contentigloo.com.